The wind carried the scent of smoke long after the fire had gone. Ash Hollow, once a bustling waypoint for weary travelers crossing the western plains, had grown quieter over the years, and now, as the sun dipped below the jagged ridge, its golden light catching the dust that hung thick in the summer air, a lone figure walked the edge of town, shrouded in black, face hidden beneath a dark lace veil. Children scattered at the sound of her boots on gravel. A dog whimpered and backed away. No one spoke her name aloud anymore. They only whispered when she passed. She was Clara Whelan once, a schoolteacher, bright and warm as morning light. But that was before the fire, before the screams, before the townsfolk turned their eyes from her and began calling her something else. Ashes. She lived alone now in a charred cabin just beyond the last fence, where the prairie took over and the road bent out of sight. Her garden grew wild with purple sage and tough root vegetables. Her chickens rarely laid eggs, and her only visitors were shadows cast by passing clouds. Some said she'd gone mad. Others believed she was cursed, that her survival came at the cost of her family's souls. But she wasn't mad. She remembered everything. The fire had started late, the wind howling like a beast outside, a lantern, a scream, then heat, scorching and blinding, her father's voice calling her name, her brother's tiny body lost in the smoke, her own hands clawing at the windows. She carried those moments in her skin, in the way her left hand no longer closed properly, in the puckered lines that ran from her jaw to her collarbone, but mostly she carried them in silence. Tonight, the town's lanterns flickered to life one by one. Behind shuttered windows and cracked doors, people watched her walk as they always did, hearts pounding with guilt they refused to name. But Clara didn't flinch. She kept her pace steady. The veil protected them more than it protected her. She paused by the old well in the center of town, placing a small white stone on its rim, a tradition only she followed. 1 stone for each year since the fire. This made 7. The wind shifted, and for a moment her veil fluttered just enough to reveal the sharp angle of her cheek, half melted from memory. Footsteps approached. A small boy, barefoot, no older than 6, had wandered too close. His eyes locked on hers, wide and curious. Clara didn't move, but before he could speak, his mother shouted from a nearby porch, yanked him back, and disappeared behind the door. Clara turned away, but the boy had not screamed. He had not run. Something about that stayed with her as she walked back to her cabin, the white stone in the well behind her, glowing faintly in the moonlight. The next morning, as dawn crept over the red hills of Ash Hollow, a wagon rolled slowly down the main road. Its wheels creaked under the weight of old trunks and battered crates, and the driver, an older man wrapped in a tan duster, guided the reins with calm ease. Beside him sat a figure who did not watch the sun rise, did not glance at the storefronts or the curious eyes behind curtains. He sat straight, his hands folded on his lap, head tilted slightly, as though listening to something beyond hearing. His name was Elias Thorne. He wore no badge, no preacher's collar, and bore no weapon visible. But what caught most eyes, what silenced the murmurs that typically greeted a newcomer, were the grey, sightless eyes behind his spectacles. He was blind. The wagon came to a stop outside the general store. As the driver began unloading his things, Elias stepped down slowly, tapping a cane across the wooden planks. His movements were practiced but cautious, and as he turned his face to the morning breeze, a silence fell across the row of onlookers. "That the man," someone whispered. "Blind as a bat," replied another. "He won't last a week here," muttered a third. But Elias smiled faintly as if he'd heard them. "Which way to the boarding house?" he asked. An old ranch hand pointed, then realized the gesture was useless. "Down the road, just past the saloon. White building on the left." Elias nodded, offered a quiet thank you, and began walking with slow, measured steps. He didn't stumble. He didn't waver. And though no one offered to help, every eye followed his progress. At the saloon he paused. Laughter drifted out onto the dusty street, along with the clink of bottles and the whine of a fiddle. He turned his head slightly, as if measuring the rhythm of life here. Then he continued. The boarding house's owner, Mrs. Delaney, was a no-nonsense widow who ran the place with military precision. When Elias knocked and introduced himself, she looked him over, uncertain. "You sure you'll be all right on your own?" she asked. "I've managed so far," he replied with a gentle tone. She hesitated, then showed him to a room upstairs. As he unpacked, slowly but with care, She hovered at the door. "You'll hear things, Mr. Thorne. Folks talk here." "I expect they do," he said. "That woman, the one at the edge of town. People say she ain't right." Elias turned his head toward her voice. "Is she still alive?" Mrs. Delaney blinked. "Course she is. Don't mean she should be." He didn't answer. Instead, he sat down beside the small window and ran his fingers along the wooden sill, feeling the grooves time had left behind. Outside, a crow cawed in the distance. Inside, Elias tilted his head and whispered something under his breath, too soft to catch. But the air seemed to hold still, as if listening. He had come for quiet. But Ash Hollow was full of echoes. The saloon was quieter than usual that night, the piano silent, the laughter dimmed. Only the low hum of voices and the slow scrape of a card game filled the room. Elias Thorne sat near the back, his cane resting across his lap. Though his eyes could not see, his ears traced every sound like a hunter reading tracks. A man beside him shuffled in his seat. "You from the east?" he asked, testing the stranger's voice. "Further than that," Elias replied. "I served in the war, Tennessee Regiment." The man nodded slowly. "I was Kentucky myself. Cavalry. Lost half my company at Shiloh." Elias turned slightly. "Then we might have crossed paths. Too many did that day." Another silence fell between them, but a respectful one. After a moment, the Kentuckian leaned in. "Word's gone round you asked about the burned woman." Elias didn't flinch. "I did." "You sure you want to poke that hornet's nest?" the man asked. "Folks round here don't take kindly to bringing up old ghosts." Elias folded his hands. "Is she a ghost?" The man chuckled bitterly. "She might as well be." He lifted his drink, then began the story. The one everyone in Ash Hollow knew, but few dared speak aloud. How the fire came in the night. How Clara Whelan screamed louder than the wind. How the house collapsed with her family inside. How she staggered out, hair aflame, skin blistering, a spectre in the moonlight. And how no one dared to touch her. They say her own father's hand was reaching from the flames, and she couldn't pull him free. That guilt, the man drained his glass. It carved her deeper than the burns did. Elias listened, unmoving, then asked, "Why does the town blame her?" The man shrugged. "Because she lived." Outside, the wind kicked up dust in the empty street. Inside, the door creaked open. Sheriff Boone Carter stepped into the saloon with the weight of tired authority. His boots echoed on the floorboards as he made his way to the bar, nodded to the barkeep, and took a sip from a tin cup before turning his eyes toward Elias. "You're the blind man asking questions," he said. "I am." The sheriff pulled up a chair. "You'll find this town don't like old wounds reopened." "I'm not here to reopen anything," Elias said evenly. "I'm here to listen." Boone studied him. "You remind me of a chaplain I knew. Same voice. Calm, steady. Just before he prayed over a man with no legs. I'm no preacher. Maybe not. But that woman, she don't need sermons. She needs peace." Elias nodded. "Then maybe someone should speak to her instead of about her." Boone didn't respond. He finished his drink, stood, and walked away. Outside, beneath the chapel ruins, Clara stood barefoot in the dirt, watching the moon. In the stillness of the night, her fingers traced the journal in her hand, the only thing untouched by fire. The next morning brought a dry wind, the kind that scratched at windows and whispered through the eaves like voices long buried. Clara moved through the general store with quiet precision, a list clutched in her gloved hand. The veil still draped her face, but the townsfolk made no mistake about who she was. They always knew she didn't speak unless necessary. Most days no one did. Coins on the counter, a nod. Then the distance returned. Today something shifted. As she stepped toward the door, her arms full of flour and lye soap, a voice called out from behind her. Calm, low, male. "Miss Whelan?" She froze. No one had called her that in years. Slowly she turned. Elias Thorne stood near the edge of the shelf lined with tobacco tins, his cane resting lightly against the wood. His head tilted toward her, blind eyes unblinking, his expression unreadable but open. "I thought I heard your steps," he said. Clara didn't answer. Her hands tightened slightly around the bundle. "I hope I'm not troubling you," Elias continued. "It's just, I've heard many voices since I arrived here. Yours stood out." Still silent, Clara studied him through the veil. Most looked away from her, even those who meant well. But Elias, he faced her fully, waiting, not rushing the silence. "I'm Elias," he offered. "I was told you used to be a teacher." I did, she replied, voice dry but clear. He smiled softly. Then we already have something in common. I used to teach a Sunday class for soldiers too broken to stand. She didn't expect the warmth that crept into her chest. What did you teach them? Words, he said. How to speak again when silence became easier, and how to find meaning when the world had none. She blinked behind the veil, the words brushing against places long sealed. Most people just nod and move on. I don't see nods, Elias said gently, but I do hear pain and strength. I heard both in you. Clara shifted her weight, unsure whether to flee or remain. Her voice came low, brittle. People here think I'm cursed. I don't, he said, firm. Silence again, but not the hollow kind. It settled around them like shade. I walk near the chapel ruins most evenings, he added, if you'd ever care to talk. Then, with no expectation, no demand, Elias tapped his cane once and stepped away, giving her space, walking slowly toward the door. He did not wait for a reply. Clara stood still, her breath uneven. The wind pressed at her veil like a curious hand. She left the store a moment later, the weight of flour no heavier than before, but her chest somehow less burdened. From across the street, Eliza McCraw watched from her porch, eyes narrowed. But Clara didn't look her way. She turned down the road toward home, Elias's voice still echoing in her mind. Clara returned to the chapel ruins that evening, drawn by something she couldn't name. The stones were still warm from the sun, and the wind carried with it the scent of mesquite and something older. Something she once feared was memory. Elias sat beneath the twisted elm near the crumbling altar, his cane resting beside him. His hands were folded, his head turned toward the breeze, listening. I didn't think you'd come, he said without opening his eyes. I wasn't sure I would, she replied. She sat across from him, leaving a space wide enough for comfort, but close enough to be heard without raising her voice. They didn't speak right away, and when the words came, they came softly. My brother's name was James, Clara said. He was 7, slept with his boots on because he thought it made him braver. Elias didn't speak, only nodded slightly, letting her continue. My father tried to carry him out when the fire started. He handed me his journal through the window and went back for James. The roof collapsed before they made it. She looked down at her hands, twisting the edge of her skirt. People here think I stayed alive because I was strong, but it wasn't strength, it was chance, ugly, painful chance. Elias listened without interruption. When she finished, he reached into his coat and pulled out a worn leather pouch. From it, he withdrew a small piece of wood, notched and carved. I made this during the war, he said. Each notch is a man I couldn't save. She stared at it, eyes stinging. I lost my sight in a skirmish near the Mississippi. Shrapnel. By then, I'd already lost most of my friends. When I woke up in the medic tent, I wished I hadn't. He ran his thumb over the notches. Grief leaves its mark, and sometimes we let others decide what our scars mean. Clara looked up. And you? What did they decide about you? That I was useless, a burden, someone to pity or avoid. He chuckled faintly. I left them behind, wandered until I found quiet. But quiet doesn't mean peace, does it? She shook her head. No, it doesn't. They sat in silence again, but it was no longer empty. The elm leaves whispered above them and the dusk settled in with a hush. When she finally stood to leave, Elias spoke once more. You still carry them with you, your father, your brother, in the way you speak, in the way you walk. That's not weakness. Clara nodded, then turned back toward her cabin. Her steps were slow, but no longer hesitant. Behind her, Elias remained seated, facing the wind as if it spoke truths no one else dared say. That night, Clara opened her father's journal and wrote something for the first time in 7 years. One sentence. Today, someone listened. By week's end, the whispers had grown teeth. Eliza McCraw stood at the steps of the town hall with a folded petition in her gloved hand, her lips pursed in righteous resolve. Around her gathered a tight circle of townsfolk, store owners, churchgoers, ranchers' wives, people who once smiled at Clara in another life, now nodding grimly at words that smelled of fear masked as virtue. She's drawing attention again, Eliza said, loud enough for all to hear, bringing him into her darkness. That blind man, he doesn't understand what she is. She's just a woman, Reverend Holloway murmured, hesitant. She's a reminder, Eliza snapped, of everything we failed to stop, of God's judgment, and I won't have her haunting the streets. The petition passed from hand to hand, a demand to restrict Clara's presence in public spaces for the comfort and safety of the town, it claimed. But it was fear, not safety, that moved the pen. At the sheriff's office, Boone Carter read the list silently, his jaw tight. "You know this ain't right," he said to Eliza. "It's about peace," she insisted. Boone leaned back in his chair, eyes hard. "Then maybe peace needs a different definition." Still, the paper stayed on his desk. Still, no one tore it up. That afternoon, Elias sat on the chapel wall when the sheriff found him. "Folks are stirring," Boone said, "naming her a danger, naming you foolish." "I've been called worse," Elias replied. Boone sighed. "I ain't here to threaten you, just to ask, what are you doing with her?" Elias tilted his head. "Listening. You'll make her hope again," Boone said. "And if they tear that down, it'll break her worse than the fire ever did." "She deserves better than silence," Elias answered. "You all know that." Boone didn't respond. That night, Clara didn't come to the ruins. She stayed inside, behind shuttered windows, a candle flickering on the table beside her father's journal. The air was heavy with something old and cruel, like a memory trying to be reborn. She read the list someone had slipped under her door, names of neighbors, former students' parents, people who once shook her hand at the church potluck. Her hands trembled. She thought of Elias's voice, the calm it carried, the weight of it, and the risk. Perhaps he would leave. That would be easier for him. Safer. She closed the journal. Outside, the wind had died. Even the trees held their breath. Across town, Elias sat alone beneath the elm, hands resting on his cane, waiting in silence. When she didn't come, he whispered a name, hers, just once. Then he waited still. Hope, like grief, was a fragile flame. And some nights, the darkness leaned in too close. Clara opened the door before dawn, the world still bathed in a blue hush. The silence outside her cabin was thick, but not empty. It pulsed with something waiting, like breath held too long. She walked slowly down the dirt path, past the edge of her garden, past the bent fence post, past the tree that once shaded her childhood dog's grave. Her heart thudded not with fear, but with something more tender, more dangerous. At the chapel ruins, Elias sat as he always did, cane by his side, back straight, face turned toward the wind. She didn't speak. He turned his head, smile gentle, expectant. "I wondered if you'd come." "I almost didn't," she said. "Why?" She sat across from him, her breath caught between worlds. "Because if you leave, it'll be worse than if you'd never come at all." He tilted his head. "And if I stay?" She looked away. "Then the world won't know what to do with us." He was quiet for a long time. Then he reached forward, not quickly, not demanding. His hand extended, palm up, resting in the space between them. "May I?" he asked softly. "May I hold it?" Clara stared at his hand. She'd forgotten the shape of human warmth, forgotten the weight of trust, forgotten what it felt like not to flinch. Her hand trembled as it moved. She wanted to stop herself. She wanted to run, but she didn't. She placed her scarred, twisted fingers in his open palm. He closed his gently around hers, not tightly, just enough to be real. She exhaled sharply, as if air had returned to lungs long collapsed. No one had touched her in 7 years, not out of affection, not out of choice. The last hand she remembered was her father's, through the smoke. Tears welled, unexpected, uninvited. They slipped down her cheeks before she could stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "For what?" Elias asked. "For how ugly this world made me feel." His grip remained steady. "Then let's make it beautiful again, one moment at a time." The wind stirred around them, lifting leaves in slow spirals. For the first time in years, Clara didn't feel made of fire and ashes. She felt human, flesh, nerve, soul. They sat there as the sun began to rise behind the ridge, turning the red rocks gold. She didn't know what would come next. The town's judgment still lingered like smoke on her skin. But in that moment she didn't care, because someone had asked to hold her hand, and she had let them, and nothing, not memory, not scars, not fear, could undo that. Not ever. The town noticed. It didn't happen all at once, but ripples spread like stones dropped in still water. Whispers curled through porches, into sewing circles behind pews. Eliza McCraw's eyes narrowed like a fox scenting fire. She watched Clara walk beside Elias, two silhouettes at dusk, and clutched her shawl tighter. "He holds her hand," she hissed to a group outside the post office. "In public." One woman gasped. Another simply looked away. But not all the reactions were the same. At the barber shop, Old Mr. Langley spoke through his beard trimmer. "Blind fella's got guts, maybe she ain't so bad after all." The blacksmith's apprentice, barely 17, murmured, "She used to teach me how to write my name." He said it like remembering a song from childhood. The town was waking, not yet alive but no longer frozen. At church, Reverend Holloway climbed into the pulpit with tired hands and opened his Bible, but instead of reading, he looked at his congregation, his voice uncertain, then steady. "For 7 years we've hidden behind judgment," he said. "I did. I failed her. And I fail you if I don't say it now. What we call safety may well be our shame." People stirred. Eliza left in the middle of the sermon, lips pressed tight. Outside, Clara stood by the chapel ruins with Elias. She hadn't heard the sermon, but she felt something in the air, like a shift in the earth beneath her feet. For the first time, no one turned away. They didn't wave, but they didn't hide. And then, the impossible happened. A child approached. Barefoot, dusty-kneed, carrying a bunch of wildflowers clutched in one small fist. He looked at Clara, eyes wide with wonder, not fear. "These are for you," he said. Clara crouched slowly, unsure if he'd flee, but he didn't. She took the flowers with both hands. "Thank you," she said. He grinned, then ran back to his mother, who stood still, watching, face unreadable, but she didn't call him away. Later, Elias sat with Clara beneath the elm, the wildflowers in her lap. "Did you ever think," she asked quietly, "that the world could bend?" He nodded. "It bends slowly, but it does." She traced a petal with her thumb. "I feel like I've been holding my breath for years." "Then exhale," he said. "You're still here." She looked up, eyes shining, not from tears this time, but from something gentler. Hope, small, fragile, but real. And Ash Hollow, a town once buried in silence, began to murmur again. Not with fear, but with curiosity, with possibility, with life. It happened on a Thursday, the kind of day where the wind smelled of dry wheat and thunder threatened from somewhere beyond the hills. The fire started fast, too fast. Old Tomlinson's barn, out by the southern ridge, caught with a sudden roar. Sparks leapt from dry hay bales, catching rafters, curling up toward the sky like angry prayers. Panic raced through the town faster than sound. Bells rang, men grabbed buckets, women shouted for children. Clara saw the smoke from her cabin, thick, rising. She didn't think. She ran. Gleas, already near the ridge with his cane and sharp ears, turned at the sound of distant screaming. He couldn't see the flames, but he heard the chaos. The cracking wood, the terrified shouts. They met outside the burning barn. "There's a child inside," someone shouted. "Tomlinson's nephew. He ran in for his dog." Clara didn't wait. She yanked her shawl over her mouth and darted toward the door. "No," someone cried. "She'll only make it worse." But Elias stepped forward, voice like iron. "She's the only one going in." The crowd hesitated, then cleared a path. Clara plunged into the smoke. Heat slapped her skin, memories flaring like old wounds. But she pushed forward, past the fallen beam, past the blaze licking the walls, until she found him, curled behind a feed barrel, the dog whimpering beside him. She pulled him close, wrapped him in her arms, and staggered back through the fire. Her dress caught, just the hem, but she stomped it out. Her gloves smoked, her sleeves burned, but she didn't let go. They emerged into the light together, child coughing, dog howling. Clara blackened with ash, her hands blistered and bleeding. People rushed forward. The doctor shouted for water. A woman wrapped the boy in blankets. But something had changed. No one recoiled. No one turned away. Boone Carter approached, jaw clenched. He took Clara's arm carefully, not roughly, not with fear, but with reverence. "You're hurt," he said. "I've been worse," she answered through cracked lips. Elias found her hand again, this time, in front of everyone. "She's more whole than any of us," he said. Silence fell, and then, slowly, someone stepped forward. A girl, maybe 13. She placed her own shawl over Clara's shoulders. Another man offered bandages. Reverend Holloway knelt and helped carry water. Ash Hollow, for the first time in years, did not look away. They looked at her, and they saw not the fire, not the scars. They saw the woman who walked into flames for someone else. And maybe, just maybe, they began to see the woman who'd never stopped trying to live. Weeks passed, and Ash Hollow no longer whispered when Clara walked by. The veil stayed off. Her gloves remained in her pocket. The scars were still there, flesh twisted pink and pale, But now when people saw them, they nodded instead of turning away. She returned to the schoolhouse with Elias beside her. The building had sat empty for years, but the boards held. Dust was swept, desks were scrubbed, windows opened to let the world back in. Children came, first 2, then 5, then a dozen. Some came for the stories Clara told, about stars and river paths, about books she remembered reading before the fire. Others came to listen to Elias, who taught them how to shape letters with fingers and feel sound through rhythm. He brought wooden tablets marked with symbols they learned to trace. Together they taught more than reading. They taught grace, resilience, the weight of silence, the strength of breaking it. Boone Carter helped rebuild the porch. Reverend Holloway brought books and chairs. Even Eliza McCraw came one morning with a stack of old chalk. She didn't stay long, but Clara thanked her anyway. One afternoon, the child Clara had carried from the fire placed a handprint in paint on the classroom wall. Then another child did the same, and another. Soon the wall bloomed with handprints, small, bright, overlapping like petals. Elias traced them one by one, smiling. At dusk, they would sit together on the bench outside the schoolhouse, watching, or in Elias's case, listening, as the wind swept the tall grass and laughter echoed from the yard. "You gave them something," he said one evening. "No," Clara replied. "You gave me the courage to give it." He turned to her, hand finding hers as it had the first time, gentle, sure. She didn't flinch anymore. "Do you miss the quiet?" she asked. "I have you," he said. "I'm not blind to the world anymore." She smiled. "And I'm no longer alone in it." The sky burned orange as the sun dipped low, setting fire to the horizon in colors that needed no words. Hand in hand they stayed like that, scarred, whole, seen, and Ash Hollow stayed changed, not perfect, but kinder. They weren't afraid of her anymore, because they'd seen her walk through fire twice, once to survive, once to save, and both times she had come back. Thank you for staying with this story to the end. If it moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more powerful tales like this one. And now click the video suggested on your screen to keep exploring stories that stay with you long after the final word.